My name is Tanya Domi. I teach at the Harriman Institute in the Balkan Studies program. And this afternoon, we are hosting a Balkan Roundtable discussion among analysts and experts on the region. It could not come at a more fortuitous moment. The activity level in the Balkans is probably at one of the most intense levels I've seen in the last several years. Everyone knows the headlines, the immediate headlines was yesterday's action by Bulgaria blocking enlargement of North Macedonia, a blow not only to Macedonia, but in my opinion, to the region as a whole. Local elections in BiH on Sunday, that's reset the table quite a bit. And I know that Ralph was going to weigh in on that, among others. And we have a new US administration that will be led by President-elect Joseph Biden, the most experienced on the Balkans, the most experienced national politician in the United States at this time, has been very active, in particular on Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there's a lot of hope in the region from Sarajevo to Pristina on what Joe Biden's administration will bring to the region. So I'm going to make initial introductions of our participants, and then we will begin the discussion. So joining us today is Reuf Bajrovic, who's co-chair of the US-Europe Alliance based in DC. He served as Minister of Energy of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. During the past 20 years, he's provided quite a bit of expert advisory and technical assistance to international foundations, political parties, civil society. In his work in the Balkans and around the world, he's also highly published. Delighted to welcome Ljubomir Filipović. He's a Montenegrin political scientist. For over a decade, he has been involved in his country's politics at a senior level. He's worked in the government in the civil sector of Montenegro, Brussels, Caucasus, in the US. Returning to join us today is Agon Maliqi. He is a political analyst, civil society activist, and a media writer from Pristina, Kosovo. He's also the creator and co-founding editor of Sabunker.net, an Albanian language opinion and analysis blog. Anita Mitic, good friend, joining us today from College Station, Texas, as a Fulbright scholar at the Bush School. She is pursuing her master's in national security and diplomacy. Anita is a decade-long career as a human rights advocate in Belgrade and in the Balkans in general reconciliation, regional cooperation. We are delighted that she's joining us today. And last but certainly not least is my friend, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, who is a political analyst and a public opinion expert. She is based in Tel Aviv, Israel. We are delighted to have her joining us today. She has advised on political, social, and referendum campaigns in over 15 countries, including Israel, and she has a particular expertise in the Balkans, and she's going to be able to give us some insight into the US negotiated Serbia-Kosovo economic agreement. So I'd like to turn it over to Ralph, who's going to give us an overview of the region.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Hello, everyone who's watching us live. I see we have quite a few people watching us. I have the most thankless task of giving you the lay of the land in less than 10 minutes. And I'll certainly have to omit some things that will come up in the discussion later. I'll actually go through the countries in my view in order of importance, in order of how deep the crisis in each of the countries that I'm going to talk about is. So I think the most relevant country at this moment in time is Montenegro, because I think Montenegro is the most likely country to actually have a serious backsliding in terms of their democratic norms in the next several months. If the new government takes over as is expected, most of the analysts expect a serious deterioration in interethnic relations in Montenegro. The new government will be very, very much controlled by the far-right elements that the Serbian Orthodox Church has managed to essentially put in the center of this new government. I think that the most important thing in Montenegro will be how the Albanians and the Bosniaks fare under the new government. To clearly demonstrate the intent of the new Montenegrin ruling majority, one needs to look at the number of minority ministers in the new government. As far as I know, and Ljubomir will certainly correct me if I'm wrong, Bosniaks and Albanians had almost 1/3 of the governmental posts under Djukanovic, so under previous government. The new government will only have one or none of Bosniaks or Albanians in it. Drita Bazovic will likely be the only minority representative in the new government. So this is a Serb nationalist government riddled with Greater Serbia activists. It is, in my view, the biggest Russian victory in the region since Tadic essentially decided in Serbia to sort of side with the Russians when he gave them a lot of the energy sector and essentially allowed the Russians to operate in Serbia the way they wanted to, and we've seen the results of that in the last 10 years. Next country in line, in my view, is Kosovo. I think Kosovo is in deep crisis, and I think primarily because of what the West did. I think the decision to indict Taci is, we'll see what the results are. I mean, we should let justice play out. But I think it's going to be perceived as an extremely biased decision. I think the impact of that decision will be long-lasting, because I think Kosovars will have a very different view of how justice was served in Kosovo, considering that we're yet to see a high-ranking official in Serbia convicted of massive crimes we've seen in Kosovo in the 90s. And I think the new political dynamic in Kosovo will change what we saw in the last 12 months in terms of the dichotomy between Taci's coalition and Albin Kurti's coalition, broadly speaking. I think that will change the dynamics seriously in the next few months, unless there's an indictment of a high-ranking Serbian former official or a military official over crimes in Kosovo, which we have not seen yet. I think Serbia is in a increasingly deteriorating position internally. Vučić controls everything more or less in Serbia now. There's no opposition to speak of. The media is under severe stress, and Serbia is still the leader in terms of EU integration process. I mean, that tells you everything about Brussels, how Brussels views the region. And I think the more time goes by, the more we'll see the clampdown on civil society, opposition groups, and so on increase in Serbia, because I think Vučić is going to have to make a decision pretty soon once Biden takes over where he's going to go, because I think sitting on two chairs is no longer going to be possible, because Brussels, in my view, will not be running the show once Biden folks take over. Macedonia, unfortunately, will probably be also talked about a lot in the next hour or so, because Bulgaria's decision is probably the most scandalous decision in the last 6 months we've seen in general. I mean, to block Macedonia's EU path is just pure. I mean, I have no words to explain it, really. I mean, I think it's the only worse EU decision than the decision that Macron made last year, in October last year, to actually change the rules of the accession process and essentially make the accession process much less likely. I think Bulgaria will continue paying the price for this for a long time, and I think EU will be perceived as a very partial player in the region after this by the Macedonian, especially people who are left-leaning and very European in their outlook. I think the disappointment will be very deep. And last but not least is Bosnia. Bosnia has had a local election, which gave us sort of an interestingly divided result, because the results in Sarajevo and Banja Luka were, in my view, big surprises. Very few people predicted such change. The leading parties in Sarajevo and Banja Luka were ousted. It's a very big change of political dynamic in the RS, in my view, because I think Dodik will be severely weakened because he lost Banja Luka and he lost Bijeljina, which is something that's been lost in the narrative in the last 48 hours. He's also likely to lose in Srebrenica if the election is fair, which will mean that he will have to change his strategy politically, because he looks much weaker now than he ever did in the last 14 years, in my view. SDA got a thorough shellacking, as President Obama would say. They got seriously damaged politically in Sarajevo. They lost mayoral seats that few people thought would happen. They were, I mean, to give you the level of surprise here, the incumbency advantage in Bosnia, because we have a first past the post system for mayors, which was introduced in 2004, is so strong that between 95 and 97% of mayors get re-elected. It's extremely rare that mayors don't win re-election because of the way the system works. However, SDA got severely routed in Sarajevo for a number of reasons. And I think people, the night of the election, the commentariat, the analysts expected this to be a countrywide phenomenon. However, now, 3 days later, we actually know that the results were only confined to Sarajevo. So in the rest of the country, SDA did much better than in Sarajevo. And generally in Sarajevo, they didn't do poorly. They'll continue being the biggest party, but the political message to them is that they have to change something, which I think is going to also affect how the international community approaches Bosnia in the future. I think there's a window now for a constitutional package because of the incentives for big players to latch onto something to change the narrative in many ways. And in terms of the way that the big players have been approaching the region in last, let's say, several years, it was absolutely EU that led the process in every single of the countries. Germany essentially sets the scene in many of the, the main capitals in the Balkans, especially in Belgrade. In my view, I think Germany was in charge of a lot of the EU's decisions, that it was behind a lot of the decisions. And that's why Belgrade got the green light to be sort of the leader of this group of countries approaching the EU. What a lot of people, including myself actually, have been saying in the last few years, that the EU has allowed itself to be seen as a somewhat partisan, somewhat partial player in terms of the Muslim majority countries. Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania necessarily don't see themselves as Muslim, but I mean, the way that EU has played its cards and the way that Macron has explained his decision has led many people to believe that there's a hidden, anti-Muslim, Islamophobic element to EU's policy in the region. US essentially led from behind. I think this is the best way to explain the way that US has behaved in the region for a number of years. There were some good sides to what, I'll be honest, to what the Trump administration did. They helped Macedonia get into NATO. The Prespa agreement, in my view, is a big deal. Montenegrin accession to NATO is a historic event. But in the last 12 months, the Trump administration has made many wrong moves, especially the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, in my view, was not the right decision. However, I think that this has to be analyzed in conjunction with what the EU did. I think what the Americans did was not great, but they at least did not make it a regional issue. The EU actually connected the Serbia-Kosovo talks to Bosnia because Miroslav Lajčák, EU's envoy to the region, essentially embodies both, both areas, both regions. Turkey, I think, is an overrated player in the region. I think Turkey does not have as much pull as people think it does. Turkey, once the US re-engages, as everybody expects will happen after Biden takes over, Turkey, in my view, will be assisting that effort. I think Turkey will not oppose that. They're just looking for ways to be relevant. They have some influence over players in Pristina and Sarajevo, even Belgrade. I think they're quite close to Vučić, but I think their power is largely symbolic and nimble and strategic in the sense that they know that they cannot be the key player under any circumstance in this region. Russians, of course, the elephant in the room. I think the biggest sticking point between Biden folks and the Europeans in the next 12 months will be how to deal with Russia in the Balkans. I think Germans will continue to ask for some sort of understanding of the Russian position in the Balkans, which is what they basically accommodated the Russians in the last 12 years. Since Merkel came, but objectively speaking, once Obama came to power in 2009, Obama folks allowed the Germans to sort of take over in the region. And the Germans have wanted to accommodate the Russians in the region throughout. I think that will be, I will end there. I think that will be the most important sticking point between EU and US, how to deal with Russian influence in the region. And I'll end there. Thank you.
That was terrific. If people have a chance, I recommend they go over to Kosovo 2.0 and read their editorial written by the editor-in-chief, Besa Luci, because it is a profound discourse on what is happening in The Hague and the record that confronts not only The Hague, but also confronts the international community. It's a very, very powerful editorial, staff editorial today. So now I want to go over to Anita Mitic, who's going to give us an overview of the role of Serbia and what's transpired through this US facilitated agreement between Serbia and Kosovo. Anita.
Thank you, Tanya, very much, and thank you everyone for watching. As we said, I mean, the situation in the Balkan is very interesting. It's a very good timing for this roundtable, but also, to be honest, it's always something happening in the Balkans. So, you know, we can always organize, and I think it's good that we have as much as we can these discussions, especially for American audience and European audience, because I think it's very important to keep this people here interested in what is happening in the Balkans. So as we know, we did sign an agreement, Kosovo and Serbia in White House. I think that the signing that agreement was a good thing. I think that any kind of move forward in cooperation is good, especially when it's, you know, in cooperation with the United States. I think there was a couple of symbolic things that happened, especially, for example, that Serbia and Kosovo representatives sat on the same side of the table, with the other side of the table was United States. So I think that is a good signal. I think it's great that America is back in the game with, you know, Balkans affairs, because we are really facing unprecedented challenges, not only the Balkans, but also like in the scope of international relations and what is happening between the great powers right now in the world. It's very important not to keep any part of the world, you know, open for different influences. As you know, Balkans are severely fragile to the influence of both Russia and China. So in that sense, I do see the White House agreement very important. There are several things that are, you know, crucial in this agreement, except all the, you know, infrastructure, you know, initiatives which are important. They will make people's lives easier if ever implemented, and we will talk about implementation. But I think that also in lining in some way after a long time foreign policy with US's, you know, political goals is very important and vital for the interest of Serbia, both and Kosovo. I think that things will change when Biden comes into office. I think that his position is a little bit different. I think that US is facing itself with a lot of issues and problems right now. So I'm not sure when the Balkans will come in order to be dealt with, which does kind of leave empty vacuum for the Balkans and for different powers to, you know, influence. We have several, as mentioned, Russia influence is in several occasions was very explosive in Balkans, and I think it will be very harmful towards Serbia and Kosovo especially. I mean, we are now, all of us are shocked by what Bulgaria did yesterday, but I was thinking all day, if this is happening with, you know, Bulgaria and North Macedonia, how will process of EU integration look like for Serbia and Kosovo if Serbia and Kosovo have this kind of, you know, now when we're not even close, when we're cooperating like this. There are many problems right now. We are facing probably elections in Serbia in 2 years. again, Kosovo may be facing the election. So this constant political instability is something that is making any kind of agreement very difficult to implement. When it comes to implementation of the White House agreement, I think it's important to say that the DFC opened an office in Belgrade, which is a good sign. But I also have to say that one part of the agreement was this bringing Middle East, and I'm looking forward to talk about this into the picture of the Balkans. But that Serbia, who said that they were going to change their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that they said that Vučić said that he's not going to do that if Israel recognized Kosovo, which they did in the same meeting on the same day. So that also kind of jeopardized Serbia's EU membership or EU integration, because EU was not happy with that decision since it's counter the union's foreign policy. I think that it's important to say that that in that sense, it will be very interesting to follow how things. I think it's important that we bring EU more in this America-led dialogue. EU has a little bit different approach. I think the approach is a little bit more holistic, I would say. And despite all those, all the problems that we face in the dialogue as non-transparency, not inclusion, and all of these things, and definitely not representation. That is one of the things that really bothers me, is that EU has to be involved, because Serbia's, Kosovo's, and all the countries in the Balkans' future depends on the EU. Long-term stability, long-term cooperation among the countries is closely connected to EU. I see the biggest problem, I see the biggest threat to our democracy and to our countries if EU gives up us. And I believe that this new coming administration did say several times that they will, work more in reestablishing transnational cooperation, that they will be more involved, and that they do not support this kind of diplomacy that happened in Trump's time. Even though I agree with Reuf, it did have some good things, not only the bad ones. But I think it's extremely important that we bring, that we keep Serbia in that game and keep Serbia in, because Serbia is very, very vulnerable to Russian imports. We saw very concerning things happening this summer in Serbia. We saw, Russian foreign minister spokesperson ridiculing President Vučić after, it was a sort of a scandal. And we saw, Lavrov coming to Belgrade this summer saying, Russia will support whatever is best for Serbia, both in Kosovo, but as long as Kosovo is under 1244 United Nations. So, it's very important to understand that Russia has its own interests, that undermining NATO, undermining West, undermining European Union is Russia's reason why they are so present in the Balkan region. But it's also important to understand that China also has interests here, and they're very heavily involved financially in Belgrade. So these are the things that we need to understand in broader international relations scope, rather than just focusing on the Balkans. One more thing I would like to say, because I think that we can further discuss all of these issues, is that with what happened with the President Thaci resignation and indictments, I think we saw how vulnerable and fragile any kind of dialogue and any kind of cooperation is. I think we have to be extremely careful when we talk about, bias of the international courts, because I think that will lead us to the rabbit hole where there is also such a severe movement against the courts in Serbia. So if we start undermining now the courts, it would just give the wind in the back to all sorts of crazy and nationalistic in Serbia, and a lot of things that the courts already did. And it did provide some kind of justice, and not of course full, but some kind of. It will be very important to be careful how we address this. Also, I would like to say that we saw different events, honestly, these days in both Serbia and Kosovo. Merbice Dobar Dan Festival, which was just organized, was severely threatened, severely opposed in Serbian society. So I think that when it comes to, regardless of the implementation and what is happening on international level or when it is happening on the political level, that we have to think about what is happening on the ground level. And my vision is, and even though I'm not in Serbia right now, but I think that we can all agree that we can see that the tensions are highly rising, and that there is a huge problem among society, among the people. And in the end of the day, I think that is the most important part, that we cannot forget that this is what we are doing is all of this. The only point, it has the only point if we, provide a safe surrounding for people to live normally and to live beside each other, with each other, and to, have some kind of perspective future before literally everyone leaves.
Thanks, Anita. We need to.
Yes. So yeah, I can finish with that, and then we can discuss further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to remind our audience that they can submit questions through the Zoom chat and also through the YouTube submission of questions. So over to you, Agon, and we'll hear your thoughts on this agreement and other dynamics within Kosovo today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, for the chance and for the invitation to speak in this panel. I'll start by saying that I'm actually quite pessimistic about where things are going. I think the last 2 or 3 years, there was a bit of a, kind of a chance of the last train for some sort of breakthrough between Kosovo and Serbia. And I was recall saying 2 or 3 years ago that if this train would be missed, then I think we're going to be stuck in a kind of like another lost decade in the Balkans. And I fear that scenario is unraveling. The agreement in the White House that was signed, I think it was in September, it already feels like belonging to a past world, So the analysis of it differs, from when it was signed, and now, a lot has changed. Not just Biden winning the elections and what that means, but also the specialist chambers indictments that have completely sort of impacted Kosovo severely domestically. And also EU accession kind of continuing to further become even more of a joke, sort of with the EU losing almost all of its sway in the region. So it's a new scene, it's a new moment to look at the agreement. When the agreement was signed, I was not that as harshly critical as most people were, because it was not, it solved nothing, but it was not without impact. That's how I can kind of describe it. It was more of a bilateral commitment of both countries with the Trump administration foreign policies within a Kosovo-Serbia agreement. But even for Kosovo, there were some important wins. The Israel recognition was something tangible. It's important for Kosovo's narrative. Disrupting Serbia's, all Vucic's geopolitical games. I think that's also a positive for the region as a whole, and Kosovo also benefits from that. The U.S. commitments for financing in the region are also important, and I think these are the kind of things that will, even though it's a Trump administration agreement, I think in broad sort of strokes, these will continue to be U.S. foreign policy priorities in the region. And for Kosovo, it was also important to preserve relations with the U.S., even with an unconventional administration. So I think, averting some sort of rash disaster, withdrawal of U.S. troops and things like that, I think in that sense, Kosovo's kind of engagement of this was kind of, trying to avoid any kind of, unnecessary risks from a very unconventional, realist kind of administration. Where Kosovo goes from here, in the immediate sort of in the short term, we're in a state of paralysis. Domestically, the specialist chambers have really unraveled everything. We don't know whether they're going to have elections. Even if there are elections, there might be a new kind of new governing elite with Kurti leading, but he still does not have he will still need coalitions. It's a bit of uncertainty in terms of, everybody's focusing now on the power shift domestically, and there's no momentum, there's no interest, there's no dynamic, there's nobody with political capital to move anything forward right now in the dialogue. And even if some of that is resolved, any new government will be even more reluctant to engage in its beginning to spend political capital on the dialogue. So Kosovo will need to, I guess, learn to live in this limbo, international limbo, and try to mitigate the risks and do as much as it can. There is no domestically no space for any compromise, which some in the international community, especially in Europe, expect from Kosovo. I feel the sides are now further apart than they were years ago. Anger and resentment is increasing. And there's a sense that Vučić is not even interested in an agreement, so why even bother? And that nobody's really actually pressure him into agreeing to something that Kosovo can accept. And also there's this, this perception of this militarization in Serbia that is seen as a threat. So I think we're kind of going further apart rather than coming closer to what should have been this big bang or this mutual recognition agreement. And also the external dynamics are not going well. EU accession, Serbia sees no incentive to recognize Kosovo now. EU accession is nowhere. Kosovo did not even get visa liberalization. It does not see Brussels as a reliable, not because Brussels itself is a problem. We have to distinguish between the member states who are effectively undermining anything that Brussels does. But I think the key thing will, as it was mentioned earlier, will be this Russia and by both Reuf and Anita, this Russia-US dynamic, how that will unravel in the context of a Biden administration. I think this will be the key thing that could push things either in a positive or negative direction. But the Biden administration, I think, is generally welcomed in the region, especially in Kosovo. It's positive in terms of U.S. is back as a values player in terms of democracy promotion. But I think there is also this fear a little bit that if there was anything positive in the Trump administration, it was their hands-on engagement. They elevated things to the highest level. And if the Biden administration go back to Obama's approach of really leaving this in the hands of in the Europeans, I fear the negative scenarios will more likely it's positive that the Biden administration does not bypass the EU or does what Grenell did, but it should be more directly involved in the dialogue. It should have a more hands-on approach to it. Insist on mutual recognition and look for ways of finding some sort of incentives for Serbia in that this mini Schengen agreement that was part of the DC agreement, but also this sort of common regional market thing. That's Serbia is the party most interested in that. So perhaps that could be something that could be used as leverage to get Serbia to recognize Kosovo. If not, if Vučić continues to sort of stall this, or because I feel that he will try to stall it as much as possible, then what I think Kosovo expects from a Biden administration is that it does not let Kosovo hostage to Kosovo's transatlantic path hostage to Serbia, because right now we have no EU and NATO path because of the lack of an agreement. And so unlocking the 5 EU non-recognizers is could be something that the Biden administration, and putting Kosovo on some sort of fast track to NATO would be a game changer in changing the dynamics and sort of the power relations between Kosovo and Serbia. It would really put Kosovo it would improve Kosovo's leverage. It would not make the dialogue as relevant and important as it is right now. And and in that context, Kosovo could if we recognize by these 5 EU non-recognizers and 4 NATO non-recognizers, then this thing can last. It's not a problem, because we would have the security architecture at least safe. But otherwise, I feel that we're going into a very risky decade. And I will conclude by this, going back to Reuf's kind of regional analysis, there are some positive signs in the Balkans. Obviously, there is this voter anger against entrenched elites, which is positive. But I'm a bit also on the skeptical side on how sustainable these changes are. because I feel that the voters are just, angry on corruption, and they are going for any option that is there available. And while in short term, this will have, I think, positive effect in establishing accountability and, in really putting a scare on these entrenched elites. My fear is that without the structural problems of the region being resolved, these are very vulnerable and wins for liberal forces, because the structural problems are still there, the bilateral disputes are still there, it's really hard to govern. It's hard for liberals to deliver anything. You see what's happening in Macedonia. They changed, they fought state capture. They changed the government with the promise of EU accession and things like that. And and it's hard to deliver for liberals to deliver these wins. So while these short-term wins are definitely sort of positive, there's this wind of change. These reactionary forces that are there, and the fact that we still have these, militarization in the region, nationalist rhetoric present, unresolved grievances throughout the region, there's a high potential in the next 5 years for reemergence of any kind of conflict, as much as there is for some sort of solution. So if the Russians want to find a region that is vulnerable over the next 5 years, next couple of years, the Balkans are a very prime target. And so I really hope the Biden administration takes this really, really seriously and does not withdraw and leave this in the hands of Europe, because the risk of serious destabilization is really high.
Thanks a lot, Agon. I think the biggest surprise out of this agreement was, of course, the recognition of Kosovo by Israel extending diplomatic relations. And for this reason, given Dr. Scheindlin's expertise on Israel and on the Balkans, we have asked her to weigh in on this curious development. Thanks, Dahlia.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for having me on this panel. It's very instructive for me as well. What I'm going to try to do is, in 10 minutes, give you a brief sense of Israel's interests as they touch on the Balkans, the US, and global affairs. US interests and why in the world they brought Israel into this whole thing, and what the agreement might actually mean in practice. Let me go back and start with Israel's interests, which, let me translate that for you. It means Benjamin Netanyahu's interests. He's a very personal politician. In recent years, he's positioned himself as the country's sort of top statesman. It's not so hard to do when you are in power for 11 years. The big leader of foreign policy. And I think that we have to remember that in the late years of the Obama administration, he faced some sense of pressure from the US and from the EU in various ways to move ahead on the Palestinian issue. He didn't want to. And instead, I think what he started to do was really aggressively cultivate a series of other friends that helped to, or tried to drive or capitalize on the major gaps between the European countries. So he cultivated Eastern European countries and the Visegrad group, and visited Azerbaijan in late 2016 and started making nice arms deals there, cultivated the BRIC countries, welcomed Duterte to the Philippines. It was almost like a numbers game of racking up friends who don't really care about things like human rights and conflict resolution. Often, not coincidentally, these are authoritarian regimes. And I think that that's more than just a foreign policy interest. I think that the impact is that they legitimize those kinds of leaders as the up and coming clubs of the world. That's my analysis. And Netanyahu didn't forget about Serbia during this phase as well. The countries have become closer in recent years. Trade has risen. Long before this agreement in March 2020, Serbia stated that it would already back then stated that it was planning to open a diplomatic mission and economic office in Jerusalem. Nice little perk for Netanyahu, well ahead of this deal. Vučić also said that Serbia was going to be making military purchases from Israel, and I quote, "They will not be small." Kosovo, of course, was really not on the radar of anybody in Israel. Israel had no particular political interest in getting involved in a unilaterally declared independence, movement that might have some ramifications for the Palestinian issue. So Israel just stayed out of it. There was no reason to get involved, no awareness at all. And then I think, to set the background for what happened in September, Netanyahu, once he had kind of successfully racked up all these other kinds of friends, began to go for the real big prize, which is relations with different countries in the Middle East, capitalizing on realignment of forces in the Middle East, with a long history we don't have time to go into. But he was able to capitalize on that realignment to try to circumvent, the historic boycott of most Middle Eastern countries, most Arab Middle Eastern countries, and not only Arab countries, of course, boycott of Israel due to the Palestinian issue. He began primarily making common cause with the anti-Iran groups, from Saudi Arabia through to the Gulf. And all of a sudden in Israel, after hearing for most of the country's history about all these terrible enemies who all hate us, you started to hear a completely different rhetoric about the moderate Sunni states, cultivating the idea that we could now be friends with them. And into this picture walks President Trump from 2016. Trump comes along and essentially puts Israel at the center of his foreign policy for reasons that we can only speculate, but probably have a lot to do with his son-in-law, his bankruptcy lawyer, the US evangelical voters, and various reasons like that. Trump, of course, is of a kind of a sort of a similar ilk of Netanyahu in terms of making foreign policy very personalized. I take that from a wonderful essay written by my colleagues over at the Century Foundation and Politico. And essentially what the US did, I think it's no secret, just heavily favored Israel's position when it comes to the Palestinian negotiations, or non-negotiations, I should say, and making rather breakthrough efforts on mediating new diplomatic normalization with the Arab countries, and especially those Gulf countries. And then closer to the US elections, of course, Trump and his advisors maybe took a page from Netanyahu and began stepping up their foreign policy game. Netanyahu has been doing this all throughout 2019 when we had 3 election cycles, making big, splashy, dramatic breakthroughs with new countries, not only in the Middle East. And it sounds like Trump sort of took a page from that and all of a sudden jumped in. I mean, it wasn't completely sudden. Of course, there's a background to it, but it did come a little bit out of the blue, this White House ceremony. And I also hear echoes of similar advisors when I hear things like, we must start with economic peace in the Balkans, because that's exactly the language that was being used in the Middle East process. So I think there were some advisors who were probably on both files, which helps to explain the question we're all wondering about, which is why actually bring Israel into this? Well, I think one clear explanation is that somebody got the great idea to give Israel, the gift of 2 new embassies in Jerusalem. If it's good for Israel, if it's good for Netanyahu, it's good for Israel. That makes the boys happy. And by that, I mean Kushner and David Friedman. The payback, of course, is that if you give Israel a gift, then you can pressure Israel to accept the US selling F-35s to the UAE. Okay, so sort of, we give you this gift, and now you have to accept that, the pill, swallowing the pill that the US wants to sell F-35s to the United Arab Emirates. The other payback, of course, I think Trump was hoping that it would play well, ahead of the elections for that evangelical vote. Didn't work out so well. And I think it's also part of the overall personalization of foreign policy. It's all about Trump getting reelected. Then the question is, what does it really do for Israel in terms of those interests I talked about before? I mean, I think Anita is right. The idea of risking this sort of burgeoning friendship with Serbia by recognizing Kosovo from Netanyahu's perspective is a bit of a waste. Why would he endanger those nice trade deals, military sales? Kosovo's never going to buy military aid from Israel anytime soon. And I think that in terms of diplomatic support, it's part, the cultivating the relationship with Serbia is part of that bigger, those longer term foreign policy interests that I described before for Netanyahu. However, it is a nice notch in the public relations side of it for Netanyahu. Netanyahu is very possibly facing yet another election. We should know within about the next 3 weeks whether there'll be another election. And he will position this as another great breakthrough with a Muslim state. He is allowed to call it that because most Israelis, let's face it, haven't heard of Kosovo. So you can quickly brand it as a Muslim country that Netanyahu has somehow, magically managed to bring around to Israel's side. And that, that just goes along with his foreign policy credentials. And I think that ultimately Netanyahu's used to backing himself into some funny corners and then getting out of them. So if I read his interests, he would prefer to cultivate the relationship with Serbia. Kosovo is great for PR. he will, have a private call with Vučić at some point and explain to him that it's not really a very meaningful recognition with Kosovo. And I don't think it will become particularly meaningful. I think it's going to be mostly about his personal political fortunes. Also, just for the record, I don't think there's much of a danger left in Israel's eyes that recognizing Kosovo, if it does come to anything, is somehow setting a precedent for Palestinian independence, because I think that Netanyahu, certainly under the Trump years, was banking on the erosion of this kind of rules-based, value-based world order. And so I think that we have to look at this triangular, strange relationship as quite a bit more about personalized foreign policy for the purposes of Trump and Netanyahu and their re-election and their domestic political positioning, and a bit of theater and PR. But I don't want that to sound like I think it's not important, because even political theater and PR can carry significant weight. And I would focus on two aspects just to conclude. One is that I think that it set the image in the minds probably of Serbia and Kosovo, and maybe other countries in the region, that the way to the global stage, the way to the American stage, runs through Israel, which is weird and not healthy, to be honest, I think, for global politics. It's not a basis for foreign relations. It will hopefully change. I mean, it wouldn't matter which country it is. Israel, being nice to Israel shouldn't be a condition for taking genuine strategic assessment of, international affairs. And the last point I would make is a word of caution, which is that, when you put a gun on the table in the first act, it goes off eventually. And if anybody needs a reminder of how dangerous it is to simply cultivate these relations with Israel for Israel's reasons, which is essentially to, have markets where it can sell things in general, but particularly military packages, all you need to do is look at the Caucasus right now to see how that works out. And since you've all mentioned at some point the militarization in the region, particularly in Serbia, we know Serbia is trying to buy Israeli arms. It's very hard right now to imagine, the former Yugoslavia exploding again into a military escalation. I hope that it's completely remote, but I don't think we can afford to ignore that.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I will make a comment on behalf of Kosovo, in that I know they have sought recognition from Israel for quite some time. Their history, and I know about this in the context of a conference I convened at Columbia in the spring on the Holocaust in the Balkans, and there was a role of Albanians in Kosovo, and much more pronounced in Albania, of saving Jews during the Holocaust. And that is an issue that many Albanians are very proud of, and they felt they deserved this recognition. And of course, Yad Vashem has documented it. So that's from the side of Kosovo. I'd just like to make that point. Now, let's open it up for a conversation with our panelists, and from the audience, questions about this agreement or issues related to the agreement. And then we will follow that with a discussion on what's going on in Montenegro, that in fact, Ralph really laid out very well about what is confronting it at this time. So Agon, we do have a question from the audience about what is the impact in Kosovo. This isn't really related to the agreement, but what has the impact of the pandemic had on public opinion and of the leadership in Kosovo?
Well, I think the pandemic is not the most important sort of dynamic in sort of the public opinion over on political part. Of course, it's the political crisis, the economic crisis that comes with it is really steering things up as well. I think the fall of the Kurtis government in March and the DC agreement and whatever, I mean, it was a very eventful year politically outside of the pandemic as well in Kosovo, and that has those dynamics have been more important in shaping public opinion. And I think the gist of the question here is, what is support for Vlendosje and Kurti increasing? There's been quite some polling, although I would question the reliability of now these phone polls during the pandemic in Kosovo's context, especially. But there is some sort of consensus that the Vetëndosje is definitely first. If you ask Vetëndosje supporters, they will say that they've grown to more than 40 or 50%. But I think that while they are definitely first, I don't think they have that much support to form a government on their own. And knowing their history and their sort of difficult relations with a lot of the parties, this will present a kind of challenge in creating a new government. And I think a new dynamic that is also shaping public opinion now is the specialist chambers and the indictments. What that usually produces in Kosovo is increase of support for those figures. We've seen that with Haradinaj in the past. Whenever he was facing trial, his party increased its vote share. So I think this is the same is now happening with Thaçi's PDK and Veseli's PDK. So that is actually having a positive impact in their electoral sort of chances. So it's an evolving sort of situation, but definitely Kurti is sort of the first party in terms of public opinion, but he will once again. I don't think he has enough to sort of rule on his own, and the coalition mathematics for him are a bit complicated.
So we actually have two questions about the potential return of Kurti, and there has been comments about why he's been hanging back. Do you have any? I think he was part of collateral damage with the U.S. pressure on Kosovo regarding the taxes on goods. What is his future? What do you think his potential future is and potential return to political life?
Well, there's two scenarios right now. The current government is unstable. It cannot stand on its own feet. So they will either expand the coalition and form a broad coalition that will take Kosovo for the next maybe year or two, and then the mathematics change, or we will go into early elections. But we will find that out within the next 1 month or two. If in case of early elections, as I said, Vetëndosje are favored to be first, he will once again have a chance to, because that he's required to be given a chance. The first, when you come out first, you become the sort of get the mandate for the prime ministers. But the coalition thing will again be tricky for him and Vetëndosje. But I think the past has been, he's learned from the experience with the LDK, and I think if he learns how to build bridges and sustain these coalitions better, he is the next leader. If not, and if the others kind of mobilize and rally against him, it doesn't matter if he comes out first. So I think that will be my summary.
Thank you. Ralph, don't you share some of Anita's opinions on how it was good for Trump engagement in the region? A lot of people among us don't like him, don't respect him, didn't vote for him, but the U.S. had really led from behind, as you indicated in your presentation, and this was an effort by him. And of course, many people think that this agreement was really a nothing burger. Let me quote that. And that it seems like, given all the actions in the past week and a half or so between elections and EU blockage on North Macedonia, that this is really feels like in the distant past, this agreement effort, and it sort of died. What are your thoughts on that, Ralph?
I think that Trump was interested in the region primarily because of his election campaign. I will pick up on something that Dahlia has said, which I'm hearing for the first time, actually, that it was I don't know how she put it, but it was basically the economic normalization that was the buzzword for Israel-Palestine dispute. And once the question that I always had was, and this has been EU's line in the region for the last God knows how many years. The question is, who benefits from the status quo? Because once you start talking about economic normalization, what you're basically talking about is maintaining the status quo. And my experience, and I think history shows, that status quo usually lasts as long as the stronger side has an interest in it. So I think what Vučić tried to get from Trump, and I think he was somewhat successful in getting that, minus the optics. I think the optics really did damage to Vučić when he was sitting across from Trump on a small chair, and I think it was quite humiliating. But I think Vučić succeeded in getting the Americans to pretend to be playing some sort of a game with him and Kosovo, while at the same time he got validation for a lot of the stuff that Agon mentioned, especially the arms procurement. The Serbian arms, the incredible spending that Serbia's done in the last several years to procure arms is the most underreported story from the Balkans in the last several years. The question that some of us, Agon included, have been raising for several years is, why is Serbia arming? Who is Serbia going to defend against? There's nobody Serbia should be afraid of in its immediate vicinity. The message has always been, and some of these arms and the exercises that they've used to present those arms were clearly designed to show that there's an intent to use military force down the road once that becomes possible. And I think Kosovo was never really the target of this. I think Kosovo is still under serious US protection because of the bond steel base and the other countries that are present there, but primarily the US. Serbia actually is interested in doing something in Bosnia in the long term. Some people disagree with that, but history showed that that's simply the case. Serbia has only been expanding in the last 200 years. I don't think there's a state in the world that's expanded more than Serbia in the last 2 centuries. It's an expansionist power by nature. I mean, the culture is based on expansionism. So to think that Trump could somehow solve this issue was absolutely naive, because Serbia does not have any interest in striking a deal with Kosovo. That much is apparent now. How that affects internal dynamics in Serbia is unfortunate. There's really not much hope for serious change in Serbia, and I understand Anita, who I respect and like a lot, because to live under Vučić in Serbia, where the society actually is not only militarized, but also there's this feeling of extreme focused on religion. I mean, I think Serbia is the most. I don't want to. It's really the church and state have merged. I think that's the best way to explain it, and that's now transferring to Montenegro. And a lot of people who are on the left, European leaning, are desperate. They're trying to latch onto the EU hope as a sort of a sign that there's a way to get out of this quagmire. And I'm not sure that there is. I don't think in the next several years, I think that's certainly not going to happen. And what the policy of the Biden administration should be is, as Agon said, I absolutely agree with Agon, and I'm absolutely anxious to hear what our friend Ljubomir has to say, is to protect the neighborhood from Serbia. It's as simple as that. The Biden administration must step in and make sure that that EU leadership phase is over, because EU has essentially led Serbia to believe that expanding its borders is still a possibility, because EU has pulled out all of its troops from Bosnia and has signaled that it's willing to participate in rearming of Serbian military. France has decided to sell some serious equipment to Serbia, contrary to what most analysts and most people covering the region would advise France would do. The Chinese have provided the drones, the Russians have provided countless hardware. So Biden administration, in my view, will focus and should try to do what Trump could not do, which is basically create some sort of stability in the region that would mirror what the US did after Second World War in Western Europe and Korea. I think people forget about how successful U.S. was in imposing stability in Korea. Unless, of course, the U.S. wants to treat Serbia the way it treated the Palestinians, which I think is not a controversial thing to say. As Dahlia said, the U.S. has taken a side in the Israel-Palestine conflict and should take sides in the Balkans as well. Because the dream of European integration process, the dream that the prospects of European integration would somehow induce change in the region are dead. That dream no longer applies. Nobody believes it. It's time to wake up and smell the coffee. We should live in the real world. And the last point I'll make is that I think the court's decision to indict Taci will have long-lasting consequences, because the perception now is that court is partial. This is a court that will write history in 10, 15 years' time. If Taci is convicted, if he's guilty, he should be convicted. But the narrative will be that, in a way, it would criminalize Kosovo's defense. I mean, that's the implication. Were there war crimes committed by the KLA? Absolutely, I think there were. But were there war crimes committed by the French resistance? Did the US commit crimes in Normandy? Were there American crimes in Italy in the 43, 44? Of course there were. But did we insist on prosecuting those and not prosecuting the Nazis? No. So I think this is the dynamic we should be aware of, and the Kosovars are reluctant to say that. There must be somebody, high-level person from Serbia indicted, especially having in mind that the Bitici brothers are still, their family is still looking for justice. So I'm hopeful that Biden administration will have a chance to change all that.
Okay, thanks very much. I want to ask Dahlia really quickly, and maybe you too, Ralph, but let's do this quickly. There's a question that, well, Kosovo gets an embassy in Jerusalem and Serbia does, but Serbia doesn't want to move their embassy. But what about Bosnia? Does this create an opening for Bosnia having an embassy in Jerusalem? Dahlia, what do you think?
I mean, Israel would be happy, Israel under Netanyahu or anybody who might replace him in the near future, which is unlikely, but they would all love to have as many embassies as possible in Jerusalem. Nobody would say no to that. Netanyahu has successfully made embassies in Jerusalem into a consensus issue, and everybody is afraid to go against him on that. Same with normalization with the Gulf countries. It's just not fashionable to talk about why this might be problematic from other perspectives, but I'm just not sure what that does for Bosnia.
Right.
So moving the embassy to Jerusalem, how does that help Bosnia? I mean, I'm not sure why that should be any of these countries' priorities. And in fact, again, I don't really believe that both Serbia and Kosovo will open a full embassy. Right now, Netanyahu is busy downgrading or trying to massage the Kosovo recognition. Because again, my argument is that Serbia is still more important for him and this deal doesn't look good for them. So I don't think any of them are really going to turn out to be, so I don't think Kosovo will turn out to be a full embassy. Maybe it'll be some sort of representative office, or if it is, then Serbia will turn into a representative office of some lower status. And sure, if Bosnia wants to do that, but what I guess I was trying to say earlier is that I think there's this sense that if you please Israel, that's the way to American, favorability. And I think that was a wrongful attitude to begin with, and I don't think it will last.
Ralph?
Yes.
Quickly, please.
Bosnia will not be doing that. I mean, that's just politically impossible. So I think that's just not going to happen. I mean, Dodic tried to play a game, as Dahlia said, of sort of cornering the other two members of presidency into being perceived as anti-American, which was ridiculous. It backfired on him, and it's just not going to happen. I think Bosnia's case in America is much stronger than how US sees Israel. I mean, I think Bosnia has the ability to actually openly, more or less, be supportive of the Palestinian cause, while at the same time recognizing Israel's right to exist and having embassy in Israel. That Bosnia follows the EU position on this, and I think is able to pretty much allow itself to do that. But the key thing that Dahlia said is that Kosovo mattered to Netanyahu because it's a Muslim state. This is a controversial position in the Balkans because people in the Balkans, Bosniaks and Kosovars, and the Albanians as well, do not feel comfortable being perceived as Muslim. I mean, there's a historic reason for this, right? So I've actually been talking about this for a few months now, because I figured that EU's position in the region must be determined by something else other than the democratic criteria and the accession criteria they proclaim. Because if you apply the democratic and accession criteria, should Croatia be a member of EU? Should Serbia be at the forefront of EU accession? Absolutely not. I mean, even look at, let's not even talk about Hungary. So I think the Muslim angle is something that the white Muslims that live in Europe, that, me and Agon, we're secular mostly, but I mean, you can't get, Hannah Arendt has said this many years ago, that, if you're attacked as a Jew, you have to defend as a Jew. So, even if you're a cultural Muslim, or if you're just a, secular Muslim, if they perceive you as a Muslim, there's no way to get out of that position by claiming that you're not, because you're not the one who decides how you're perceived, right? So I think the EU and the Biden administration can show to the Muslim world that it cares about Muslims by pushing one of the Muslim majority Balkan states to actually enter the EU. I mean, this would show that there's no such thing in Muslim Europe, that there is no double standard, that Bosnia, Kosovo, and Albania are not treated the same way as Turkey just because they're Muslim. Because if you look at democratic indicators, Bosnia is doing much better than a lot of EU on press freedoms, for example. Albania is doing much better on some other issues. In terms of tolerance, I mean, let's not even go there. I mean, they're much more tolerant society than some of the EU countries. So this is an angle that I'm glad Dahlia raised this, because I didn't want to raise it because some people were uncomfortable with me saying this, that people in the Balkans have to be aware of and should embrace, in my view.
I do want to clarify, though. I wasn't calling Kosovo a Muslim country. I was shocked when I first heard it.
You were quoting Netanyahu.
Yes.
And then Biden quoted that. I mean, Biden actually in his statement said the same thing, which Trump said it. People were saying, well, it's just a far right wing thing. No, it's the way you're perceived, and people should deal with that.
Yes, it's an issue that I've corrected a lot of people on, because Kosovo does not refer to itself that way. And it is multi-religions are in Kosovo and in Albania as well. So, now we're going to move towards Montenegro. Ljubomir Filipović is going to give us a presentation on the elections, the consequences of the elections. Ralph laid out some of the major issues, the Russian influence in a NATO member state. These are big, big issues. You have the floor, Ljubomir.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for a beautiful and your perspectives on what's happening in the Balkans. So during the election campaign in the US, I had a chance to go over the old Biden's appearances over his speeches in the Balkans, and something really it was his rationale for lifting embargo for the arms in Bosnia during the 90s. And he mentioned the disbalance, and he was repeating it, the disbalance that is happening currently in the Balkans as a result of, I would say openly, the EU policies in the Balkans, and especially the Trump's administration's doings. So for the first time after a long time in history, after the beginning of the news, we have a dominant Serbian politics in the Balkans. And the result of the elections in Montenegro is a result of the Serbian dominant position. So many of us were surprised in Montenegro with the beginning of January and end of December of how strong the movement, Serbian Orthodox Church movement was, how strong the reaction was after the controversial law on religious freedoms was brought in Montenegro. When it comes to Russian influence, I think that Russian got really smart. And I was still thinking in the discourse of 2016 and the failed coup attempt and the cartoonish investigation and everything what's happening after, Russians started developing much cynical and smarter policies. They started developing their soft power in the Balkans. You can see the change. They brought the new ambassador in Montenegro. They started investing in students in scholarships. They're bringing young Montenegrins to Russia to study. Russia is now launching their own USAID for the first time. So they're learning. They're learning how to use the soft power. It's not anymore shady GRU agents that will hire Serbian and nationalist thugs that will create problems. They are spreading their influence in a much smarter way. So with the church, they were presenting their own agenda. They were sending Russian priests from Ukraine to participate in the mass processions in Montenegro. And they were sending the clear message that what is happening in Montenegro is something that has parallels in Ukrainian history. So there's a parallel with this, what is happening actually right now in Northern Macedonia, when Bulgarians want to prove, that Macedonians are part of their ethnic history, national history. So this is what is happening. That was what was happening in Montenegro. Serbia has in place a strategy for cooperation with the Serbs in the region since 2011. And it was very controversial. The first draft was so controversial that after the protests from Croatia and Montenegro over some stipulations of the strategy or some parts of the strategy that were actually interfering, trying to interfere within political systems of Montenegro and Croatia, they were changed. But the main message of the strategy is that they want to influence regional politics by weighing in with Serbian ethnic minorities, by using Serbian ethnic minorities in Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Kosovo, in order to influence the country's politics. What happened in Montenegro is that you now don't have a complete control over the winning ideology from the Serbian state. So there is a part of the new majority in Montenegro that is controlled directly. The bigger part of the new majority of the Serbian nationalism that had won in the elections is not controlled by him. So this is this alternative Agon was talking about, the alternative elites that Serbs reached for in order to win over Vučić. And this alternative was a populist Serbian nationalism that is mostly criticizing Vučić, not for the lack of democracy in the country, not for the stolen institutions, but for him betraying nationalist ideas, and for him betraying Kosovo, to be precise. That is what happened in Republika Srpska in the elections right now. So we have the elections in Banja Luka, when you had a candidate that won the elections against Dodik, who was arrested the night before elections in Montenegro for participating in nationalist gatherings, and the person who is going 27 years old person, a young leader and politician that goes out in public and talks about a non-existing Montenegro nation as if it was something normal. So now what is happening in Montenegro is that we have a new government comprised mostly of the people that were handpicked by the Serbian church, people with very bizarre ideologies, people that have very bizarre public statements. And the biggest problem is, and I understood, that they were helped and supported to gain power in Montenegro by a political force that is part of this ideology, but that are being used as useful idiots to install people to install people that are really that really got involved into politics, not because of the lack of democracy, as I mentioned before, but for the purely nationalistic reasons. So with the new with the new administration in the US, I hope that the America will come out from the retreat, not just regionally in the Balkans, but that they will come out from the foreign policy retreat globally, and that it will affect this rise of nationalism in Serbia. And after I was listening to what you were saying about arming, Serbian arming, about which is more dangerous and important is about the revisionism and of history of our history. So under the fake narrative of Serbophobia and against Serbophobia, we are experiencing the revisionism of the Milosevic role in Serbia, in the region, and in the wars during the 90s. Most dangerous that is been put into place in the Balkans. And the second most dangerous thing is that we have first time people from Serbia and from the region that are coming from the moderate political backgrounds that are now making coalitions with the people that are placing these dangerous national narratives for the reason of the fight against the autocratic leaders in the Balkans. So this unwilling coalition of moderates and in some cases liberals with the nationalists and conservatives is something that really contaminates the public discourse in the Balkans, and that is the biggest reason experiencing the political change in Montenegro, which was, as Reuf have said, hasn't been a progressive one, but has been a step backwards into the country's democratic development.
That's a good place for us to now have a discussion about the situation in Montenegro, and I thought Ralph really laid it out. Thank you very much, Ljubomir. It's hard to get your head wrapped around. It's really complex, but I think Ralph did lay it out in terms of Montenegro's security, how politically fragile it is. I just have a quick, really question. Do you really think this coalition is going to be able to last? I don't know how the government functions in this coalition. What are your thoughts on that?
They have, by their own supporters in the parliaments, they have been set up a time frame of 200 days to prove to them that they are willing to follow the ideology that was coming from the right-wing Democratic Front. I think that they're going to create the government by the beginning of December, just as the parliamentary session is already, I think, set up for December the 2nd. And then I think that for the first year, until some of the political subjects in the new majority, until they feel they're ready for the elections, I think they'll have a 200 years to up to 1 year to prepare for the new elections.
Okay. We have a question from the audience about what will be the position of Dragan Bajrovic. Will he be a foreign minister? What are your thoughts on what his future holds?
So he has been offered the position of the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, but there have been some opposition. There has been some opposition in the new majority for him to take place, as they agreed that there will be no political leaders in the new government. So we still have to wait for a week or two to see if he will be Minister of Defense. But for sure, the position of Deputy Prime Minister is something that is promised to him by the Prime Minister in waiting.
Thank you. Ralph, what are your views on where this situation is exactly? I mean, you mentioned it in your opening remarks, but we're talking about a NATO state, a NATO member state that has a very pro-Russian, likely to be a very pro-Russian government. What's the upshot from that?
Well, the new government will certainly have, in my view, will focus on the law on religious freedom first. And I think that is the most important post-NATO accession law in Montenegro. The Montenegrin government made a strategic error in not explaining what the law really is to international audiences at all. The narrative around the law has been more or less set by the Serb nationalist elements and the Serbian Orthodox Church. In its essence, the law does what any law in any serious democratic country does with religious communities. Religious freedom is guaranteed, but the Serbian Orthodox Church de facto is a foreign agent in Montenegro. It does not exist as a legal entity within the country. And if history is any guide, the Montenegrin Church de facto joined the Serbian Orthodox Church after the so-called Podgorica Assembly in 1918, when Montenegro lost its independence because of a set of circumstances and foolishness of its elites. So I understand the sentiment from both sides, to be honest. And I think this issue will not go away. I think the Biden administration is going to have to deal with this the moment, they won. I mean, Montenegro will not be a stable place once this government takes over. The night of the election, these people celebrated by going to North Montenegrin town of Pljevlja and promising the Bosniak population there a new Srebrenica. I mean, this is far worse than anything we've seen in Charlottesville in the US, for example, where the neo-Nazis at the far right would march. I mean, this is not Jews shall not replace us. This is we will cleanse the Muslim, the Turk from Montenegro. And this is the platform of the new Montenegrin government. A lot of people who've supported them, especially in Brussels, should feel somewhat, I'd say ashamed of themselves, because they basically unleashed this on the Montenegrin, Bosniak, and Albanian population. And this is mirrored in the makeup of the government. I mean, the only Bosniak or Albanian in the government will be Mr. Bajrovic, who's viewed across the region as a sort of a pawn of Belgrade government, especially Vučić. So I expect more instability, and I think that the government will not last a long time if it deals with the law on religious freedom first, and I think it will.
And Anita, there's been a lot of discussion here about Serbia and what Serbia's motives are and what they're doing through religion, etc. What are your thoughts about what Ljubomir's discussed, and also Ralph's comments about what Serbia's objectives are in the region? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Tanya. Well, it is very complex issue, and I think that we tend to forget that Serbian people living in Serbia are also the victims of these current regime. Vučić is having overwhelming support in Serbia. The opposition is very weak. The loudest opposition is very well, I don't know how to say that too politely, but they have very different from us opinions about the region and the world again generally. I think that why Vučić cooperated so well with Trump was one of the reasons that I feel like all of these people are kind of the same. You know, there's politicians, they learn from each other and they just, you know, find very easy fix for a very complex region, for very complex problems, and they think that it will work. But we need to understand that there is no peace and stability in the region without Serbia. We need to find a way to incorporate Serbia in this dialogue, in this discussion, because you know, we've been here for, you know, it's been so long, decades have passed since the war ended, and we are kind of back in the start. We are, you know, we are not in the war, but I do agree with Agon that there is high conflict potential in the Balkans. I think it doesn't have to, it will not take a lot, and I think that can be very, you know, messy. I hope not bloody as it was, but it could be very, you know, very problematic. But, you know, so we need to kind of change something. We cannot simply always be in the same vicious circle of having either authoritarians or either opposition that is influenced by Russia or some other nationalistic. We need to get out of that vicious circle in many. So, and I think that is kind of a responsibility of everyone. I think that we see this toxicity that Reuf was talking about in Serbia, and it is very scary, you know. But I think that there has to be another approach to it than just, you know what, we are not going to talk with you, because if we do that, if we exclude, like, you know, the biggest country in the region, then, you know, others who have their own interests will take over. And I want to return just to 1 second to Israel, because I think it's important to say that Vučić did find a good and easy way to the White House through Israel. He was a keynote speaker in the most important DC conference, Israeli conference. And I think that, you know, it's scary how this wave of populism kind of dictated us, dictated like the future of, or like this last 4 years. And I think that consequences that will not go away easily. So either we, you know, sit here and try to like find a way that is it better to have the authoritarian leaders, and or it is better to kind of find a way how to discuss and to kind of pacify the people. I mean, it is, or I think that unfortunately we're not going into the bright future in the Balkans, and that will affect everyone. And you know, you have learned that unfortunately on the very expensive lesson that if they don't engage, you know, on time, then they pay much greater price.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question from the audience, and just really quickly, I'd like to hear every panelist's input on this. No EU enlargement for North Macedonia, but Albania gets the green light. We haven't really talked about Albania this afternoon. They seem to, I mean, they have some difficulties in their government too. The opposition earlier was boycotting the government. Agon, you might have some thoughts on Albania getting the green light, but the fact that Albania gets the green light, North Macedonia doesn't, what message, first of all, what message is being sent to the region on these actions? And is Albania really the big winner here at this moment?
Actually, yeah.
We'll start with you, Agon. We'll start with you.
Yeah, actually, Albania also has an issue with the Netherlands, particularly. So Albania will also not get does not get go ahead, I think. So, but for this
is that definitive? Is that definitive?
Because I think so, right? I mean, it's been. I mean, the Netherlands has been staunchly sort of blocking Albania. But not just Netherlands, it's also Denmark and a few other countries that are skeptical of Albania, mostly on rule of law issues. So I think, generally the mood is even if there is a yes or a no at this stage, the problem is that the whole accession method, the change in methodology and everything, has created this perception that enlargement will be an extremely slow process, and realistically, there will be we should not expect anyone from the region to join realistically in the next decade. With enlargement now being seen like that as extremely tough, and in a lot of cases unfair or stuck because of these bilateral disputes or silly requests, like Bulgaria's, for example, this has completely undermined the impact of accession on reforms or reformist forces. So I think this will be the key dynamic over the next decade, because if elites and if voters do not believe that EU accession is tangible within the next decade, this has impact on peace processes, just like Kosovo and Serbia. It weakens the EU's role and leverage in that, but also for democratization. So I think we still fail to realize how, it's not just about Bulgaria. It's not just about what Greece did to Macedonia also in the past. It's not because of Kosovo, like what Kosovo is facing with visa liberalization. It's now it's now become a really deeply structural problem. And with enlargement, realistically, people increasingly getting the sense that enlargement is not going to be that. This is why now the security questions are being opened, and why we will have a security kind of problems at the forefront of the Balkans. The EU is now trying to kind of compensate this lack of political weight with economics as well. They're going to throw in a lot of money in the region. They've budgeted a lot of investments now for these, regional infrastructure projects, connectivity. The US is also involved in that as well. Whether money will be enough to kind of, feed this sort of positive dynamics in the region without resolving the bilateral disputes and the security concerns, this I think is the key question going ahead. But enlargement as such, and the enlargement process, really, I don't think anyone with a realistic understanding of politics in the Balkans can trust EU accession in the next decade and possibly two.
Thanks. Dahlia, what are your thoughts on this EU enlargement issue?
Well, I'm getting very nervous and pessimistic listening to my colleagues, but I think it's a very realistic assessment. And I have to say that I think at this point, we have both Agon and Reuf who said this essentially agreed on a very disturbing aspect, which is that the idea that the EU accession process is what's going to bring both hope to the hopefuls countries and genuine stability is, I think Reuf said it was like the dream is dead. So I'm wondering what they have left. And if this is going in the direction, I completely agree with Anita that there's been like this kind of alliance of the populists. That's what I was trying to get at in terms of Netanyahu's foreign policy over the, during the late Obama years through to the present. Is, that's one direction the future could take, is that these sort of populist strongmen just drop all the idea of, nice international alliances that were built in the post-war era to help keep the stability, just kind of don't bother trying to join those alliances with all of their pesky values about rule of law, keep electing populist leaders, keep buying arms from Israel. And then eventually those guns go off, like in Azerbaijan, where Israel has been selling arms since 2016. And now we're seeing thousands of people dying in the last number of weeks. So then, the countries all just bow before the raw force of great powers like Russia and Turkey. If anybody's following, of course, Turkey's involvement in the Caucasus, but let's not forget that in the back door of Europe, Northern Cyprus, Turkey also has a stronger hand than it did a month ago. And so I guess, all I can say about that is that I hope that's only one possible path for the near-term future, and that there is an alternative path that somehow, you know, a Biden administration thinking in a sophisticated way, after he revives the JCPOA with Iran, will then turn, you know, much more significant attention to really what's happening in Europe, try to revive this. I'm not sure if I have any other solution, but to try to revive the path that joining multilateral institutions like that could, you know, offer for greater stability. I also want to go back and clarify, if it was not clear from what I said earlier, money and economic peace, I don't think will ever be enough. It won't be enough. I mean, it's been tried, to be blunt, and not only in, you know, I'm not just talking about the Middle East, I'm talking about, you know, various other conflicts that I've worked on, including in the Balkans. You know, money was not the issue. I don't think the Balkans went to war with, I don't think former Yugoslavia collapsed because of financial issues. You know, money does not solve these things. We're talking about the manipulation of nationalism with religion, you know, with populism, with victimization and grievances. These are much more toxic brews than money. So I don't think we have an option but to find that other route to the rather dark path that we could be on now.
Thanks, Dahlia. Anita, what are your views on this enlargement and where the EU stands at this moment in relationship to the region?
Yeah, well, EU will have to kind of sober up and like decide what are their politics. I think that you know, the fact that that Kosovo still has no like visa liberalization, I think that's just devastating politics. I don't think it's smart politics to keep one, you know, country so disconnected from the rest. And I think that some things has to be changed. I think it's good that like kind of America pushed EU now into like, you know, back into to deal with the Balkans. That's how I perceive it. And but I stand by what I say. I think that we have no chance without EU perspective. And I think that, you know, all of this that is happening, all this rise of authoritarianism, all this lack of democracy, and we are severely backsliding, you know. So I think that all of that additionally without EU will just be a complete disaster. And so I firmly believe that, and I think as long as like more people and more international, you know, actors are paying attention to the Balkans, better for us, because we know that we will not do a lot by ourselves. Like we need that kind of international pressure, and I just think it's very important to understand that we don't live in the same world we lived 10 years ago. Like the same rules does not apply anymore. It's not anymore based on values. It's not. And the membership doesn't mean what they meant before. So I think I think that we need to have that kind of strategic, you know, approach and towards the EU too. So yeah, that's my opinion.
Thanks very much. Ljubomir.
So I would just add that Dahlia just gave us a great overview of what does it mean, not just for the Balkans. If we are about to snooze and postpone our dreams, and if we are about to be so pessimistic in the Balkans, what should we say about the Caucasus? What should we say about Georgia, who are also expecting, who are really putting themselves into reforms? What should we say about Ukraine and Belarus and Moldova? So those are all the friction regions that are behind us even. So if we are talking about 5-10 years perspective, and if we don't have it at all, what should we say about those regions that are currently experiencing much more risk and danger of conflicts? We are seeing what is happening in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So we should have been the flagship. We should have been the example for the European Union, for the success story, and we should have been that carrot as an example for the other regions. But fortunately, we are not. And this talks a lot about the European project itself and how it is in a time of crisis for a long time already. And I think we're not moving from status quo unless and until they solve their own problems and ideas and define what will be happening with the union itself.
Okay, thank you. Ralph, really quickly, I want to get to some other questions too.
I think EU does not want a Muslim majority state to ever join it. I think the whole enlargement process since CDU took power in Germany in 2005 was essentially designed around that goal. Hence the stabilitocracy, as some analysts have described the EU's approach to the region. I think we're going to see a lot of attempts by the EU to influence Biden administration by dangling this carrot again, trying to get Biden to sort of back down in some of his requests by saying, okay, we'll be more willing to allow these countries in. So I disagree with Anita, unfortunately. I think the only country that will be a disaster without the EU is Serbia, because Serbia's position, Serbia is the leader of the region, narrative was entirely EU's, invention. So my view is that Serbia should be not isolated, should be engaged, but the neighborhood should be protected from what's going on in Serbia. And countries should be allowed to join what they want to allow. In the case of Bosnia, it's NATO. In the case of Montenegro, it's probably EU. Macedonia is a part of a different dynamic, same with Albania. But I think in 10 years' time, none of the Muslim majority countries will join the EU because that's simply not what the EU wants. And I think we need to find alternatives for that. And I think alternatives are strong, very, very strong US engagement, because one region in the world where US can do something without really expending much resources is the Western Balkans. And I think I would end with saying that EU is the problem because EU created this dynamic we live in right now, and Biden administration is the solution. If Biden people view the Western Balkans in terms of their overall relationship with the EU, we're going to have a problem, because EU will try to hold on to the region, hold on to the primacy in the region as much as possible. And in my view, that has not worked out well at all. And one last thing, I think the entire the fate of the region depends on whether Serbia sees an opening in terms of creating new facts on the ground. It should be Americans and the Brits who create new facts on the ground. Bolster HR in Bosnia, send in a couple of hundred British or American, preferably, troops to Brčko, and make sure that the Montenegrin government does not do what it's planning to do.
We have a comment from the audience, and this question asserts that you had a strongman in Montenegro for 30 years. And, and this is where I may part with Ralph a little bit. He and I've had this conversation about Montenegro. I personally have friends from Montenegro that had to leave the country because of pressure from the government, and they were journalists. They have shot journalists, they have jailed, put journalists in Montenegro under house arrest. And so
we lost you.
sorry,
Tanya,
I'm going to use the analogy of an athlete, because what happens is if you don't use those muscles, your muscles go flabby. And what's happened during that 30 years in Montenegro is that many people were blocked from politics. They were not in politics because they were not able to be, because they disagreed with Djukanovic. And it also reminds me, I'll just say this too, Montenegro, and I worked there, so full disclosure, I did work there, and I was an advisor to the government under a USAID contract a long time ago. But it reminds me, Montenegro reminds me of politics in Hawaii. Very small, very small. Everybody knows each other. There's not a lot of diversity in the population, and everybody needs something from the government. And I think that has been an Achilles heel to Montenegro. We have given Djukanovic a pass because he was not a nationalist. He didn't kill people. He didn't come between people. It didn't attack ethnicity. He was inclusionary. I mean, if you're Albanian in Montenegro, you have TV, you have Albanian radio in Albanian language. He was not a nationalist, but he was corrupt, is believed to be corrupt. And I think that's one of the problems we now have that's emerged, notwithstanding everything that has been said about the Serbian Orthodox Church. but you have a population that has not, it's been in opposition, but it's also been cowed. It's also been suppressed by elements of that government. So I'm just going to throw that out there. That's my view on Montenegro. It's really unfortunate that it is now in this situation because so many people opposed them and created these really I think, very unlike coalitions. And I don't see how that will stabilize that government. That's I'm responding to that question, but I wanted to weigh in on it. Does anybody else want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, just this is a complete truth. The most responsible for the situation in Montenegro is one who was holding power for 30 years. But I always remember Joseph Brodsky's quote from his poem or letter to his Roman friends, a famous poem by Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, who says, "A thief is dearer to my heart than a bloodsucker." And this is what I was choosing to believe before these elections, that the corrupt politician is always a better choice than the one who has bizarre idea of ethnic cleansing, has some made up thoughts about the ethnic designing in the region.
That's a very good quote. I want everybody to make one last observation. We've answered many questions. Some of them have already been answered that have been asked. I just want everybody to make a 1 minute concluding comment. Anita, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you really so much. And I think that, I'm glad that we have opportunity to openly discuss this. And I will just answer to one of the things that Reuf said in the end. And I think it's important to clarify. I do believe that Serbia will suffer the most consequences if the EU leaves. But I think that unstable Serbia means unstable region, because not only because it's the biggest country in the region, but if we talk about stability in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Montenegro, we cannot forget the big portion of those countries are Serbian population. So as long as Serbia doesn't send this peaceful message, I'm afraid that we cannot we cannot ignore the danger coming from unstable Serbia. And that's why I hope that EU and US will have holistic regional approach towards the Balkans, because I think that's the only way we can actually, meet in 5 years and still, talk about peace in the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Anita. Agon, please.
Yes, I'm sorry for contributing a little bit to the pessimistic tone. I'm generally by nature optimistic, but I'm all really worried with the parameters of, sort of the analytical and realist side of me is really winning over. And, I think the Biden win is very important in the sense that, both in terms of values, but also hopefully lessons learned from Obama's administration's kind of withdrawal from Europe. I think they've seen a little bit of what happens without the U.S. In Europe, and knowing that if you look at NATO's borders from all the way from from Belarus to go all the way going down south to the Mediterranean, there are so many hotspots of crisis right now, whether civil wars or conflicts, or even domestic political disturbances, that it's incredibly impossible. It's becoming increasingly difficult to manage all of these. And with a US that is withdrawn and with the EU that is sort of weak as a security player, I fear the Balkans will be the next vulnerable point, because the security architecture is not complete. The Baltics are of course always at risk, but they're NATO members. Here we do not. We have a few countries, especially Kosovo and Bosnia, that are still not part of NATO. And this is the next vulnerable spot. And I really hope that without a strong US and Biden administration engagement in this region, the region is really vulnerable, considering the structural kind of obstacles that we face, the bilateral disputes, the strongman rule, this can very easily go bad. So I just hopefully, like to raise this as an alarm because I don't think the region can afford another lost decade.
Thank you. Dahlia.
Sorry, you missed my thanks. I was thanking you for inviting me, but also really, it's been a very, very educational and valuable discussion with my colleagues. I've learned a lot from all of you. I'm going to plagiarize from the best of you. I think that what Anita said about just the cooperative regionalist approach, to my mind, seems the #1 task at hand for rethinking foreign policy, which has, in the meantime, descended to a level of, basically embracing the erosion of the, post-war rules-based order, which has served us so well. I think that each of the countries in the region needs to invest deeply in domestic democratization. None of this will change without that. The corruption, the party patronage, these systems are so entrenched in the Balkan region that, you can't have any buy-in for leadership until that, goes away, and it's going to take years. So, I think that, to my mind, that's the best kind of domestic activity that can happen. I think that the sides need to, this maybe sound naive, but to the extent that bigger players can pressure the regional players to stop the militarization, stop these arms deals, arms sales. Like I said, you pour, weapons into a region, they will eventually explode. And to that end, I'm Israeli, I'm sitting here in Tel Aviv, but choose your friends wisely. They do not necessarily have your best interests at heart. They have their own interests in mind.
Thanks so much, Dahlia, for participating. It was really interesting to listen to you. Ljubomir.
There's nothing much to be said except to send the message that we need a restoration of the balance within the region. So we need US back in the region. We need messages of values. Again, we need a foreign policy of values again present in the region. Just as Dahlia has said before, economy is not the biggest problem. We need to think about the values, about integrity, about character leadership also in the region. And we need to speak in those terms again. And hopefully the restoration of balance, we'll need more clearer messages from the EU and more clearer path for us to follow.
Thanks so
That's
much.
all. Thank you all for great.
Thank you so much, Ljubomir. Ralph.
Yeah, I guess
you get the last word, Ralph.
Yeah. So I think the key message is that the Biden administration is excellent news for the region. The expectations are high, but not unrealistic. The key goal should be to create some sort of balance in the region, which the EU has completely upended by preferring Serbia strongly, which has led to even Serbian internal politics becoming more nasty and more focused on really, expansionism that Serbia has historically shown in the region. The most important element of the regional dynamic should be that each country should be judged on its own merits rather than seeing the region as some sort of, a conglomerate that's really one. The region, there's no such thing as the region. The EU created what we call the region. Montenegro, Bosnia, Kosovo do not have a democratic deficit that we see in Serbia. Bosnia has just had a stunning set of results in the local elections that you don't see in countries that have democratic problems. Media freedoms are fine. Same with Kosovo. Kosovo has had change in government for several times. The media freedom issue, in my view, does not really exist. Montenegro has just had a peaceful transfer of power. Media issues have, are not as great as they are in Serbia, as in Bosnia and Kosovo. But I think are not nearly as bad as they are in Serbia. Montenegro has a strong opposition media, which nobody really denies. And I think this narrative of Djukanovic's dictator was mostly a false one, because the independence of Montenegrin media was always more or less present, unlike Serbia. So I think that Biden administration has to create some sort of framework where each of these countries goes forward. And I think if it tries to appease Serbia the way that EU has done in the last the Germans really have done in the last 14 years. We will see further backsliding and a huge disillusionment in Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Kosovo. I think Albania has a clearer path to some sort of stability because it's a NATO member and it does not border Vučić's Serbia, to be honest. So it has nothing to fear. But I think we failed to talk about Croatia's role in the region, which is as bad as Serbia's role. I think Croatia should be completely shut out of the region. I think both Serbia and Croatia just need to deal with their own issues and just forget about the bordering countries. And then the West, led by the US, can try to push the region towards some sort of stability. I like what Dahlia, or I think it was Ljubomir also said, focusing on the economic side of things means punting. It means not really dealing with the main issue. The main problems in the Balkans are political and issues of security. I think those are two things that have to be tackled in the next 4 years. And I think Biden administration can actually make this work because they have excellent people and they know the region well. And the US still has the leverage that none of the other countries have.
Thanks very much. Well, this is clearly a different point in time. We have a new American administration soon to take power, one that definitely cares about the region. I personally think the EU has really hurt itself over many, many months. But when you look at the fact that Hungary and Poland are refusing to agree to a COVID assistance package based on the rule of law, that tells you everything you need to know about the strength in Paris, not Paris, rather Brussels. And we'll see what's going to unfold, but I really appreciate everybody's participation. It was excellent. Thank you very much.